Welcome to RealTalk. I am Ambassador Curtis Moore. My special guest on this episode of RealTalk is Professor Rosalea Hamilton. She is the founding director of the Institute of Law and Economics. She is currently coordinator of the Jamaica-based Advocacy Network. Professor Hamilton, welcome to RealTalk.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is my pleasure indeed. I want to begin our conversation, and I emphasize conversation. In a recent article you wrote about the nomination of Jamaica's foreign minister to contest the Commonwealth Secretary General's post after the CARICOM heads of government had agreed to support re-election of the incumbent. And you highlighted the critical response from the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, of the Jamaican Prime Minister. And you wrote these words: "This most recent discordant conundrum forces us to seriously consider the cohesiveness and survivability of CARICOM in a rapidly changing world where global forces are realigning and redefining a new world order. Suggestive of your comment is that CARICOM is in disarray. Please elaborate a little bit on this issue for me."
Yes, well, I must say, not just myself, others were observing what's happening in the CARICOM heads of government space, have been concerned for some time because we've been seeing, nothing short of decisions that don't reflect a kind of consensus around important issues that ought to define Caribbean foreign policy. And, I'm minded of Article 16 of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas that clearly points to the importance of having collective foreign policy decisions, including decisions that relate to third-party organizations, not countries, but and through heads of state. Now, I think in that context, when we took note of what happened back in 2021, was I think 2020, December 2020, when the OAS had a meeting, and that meeting I thought was pivotal, and there's a lot of commentary, I think you yourself wrote about this, where for the first time, we're beginning to see not only did we not support our member state on its position, but we actively voted against a member state. That to me was a low point. I don't hope we won't get any lower. But that was a wake-up call for me that something is happening. And then right after that, you saw there was this effort to rally around Haiti, when they had lost their prime minister and the president, and just our leadership position as a member of CARICOM, to guide and advise and assist in this period was trumped by a set of international diplomats that just said, they did their own thing without much reference to the CARICOM. And in that context, when Prime Minister Rowley wrote what he did on Facebook, was really describing the actions of head of states as kowtowing and genuflecting. and effectively we deserve what we get. No, that kind of language and that a way of characterizing what has been happening was also very instructive. And so for me, those are important signals that we're not pulling together in the way we ought to. Yes, we have problems. Which regional organization across the world doesn't have problems? You know, they all do. So we have problems, and I think it's important for us to, in spite of our differences and our challenges that we have in pulling this region together, once we agree that we're part of this region, we ought to at least abide by the spirit and the letter of the law. That's the arrangement we put in place in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. And importantly, we ought to set that example for our people, that it is possible to work together, agree on collective positions, even when there are differences.
You're absolutely correct, Professor Hamilton. And it is an issue which I find quite worrisome. Caribbean regional integration has not progressed as it should. There was a time when Jamaica provided leadership. And I myself, as you quite rightly said, wrote in the Ward Post following that decision in the OAS to hold that meeting, which castigated a member country of CARICOM. That meeting was actually facilitated by Jamaica.
Yeah.
Because Jamaica chaired that meeting. And the CARICOM region was divided. There was an effort to prevent that meeting from taking place by other CARICOM members, which they were outvoted because some CARICOM members voted to have the meeting. In my article, I said it was shameful. As a matter of fact, if I recall, my headline was CARICOM shame or something of that nature. But we also saw the division in the re-election of this OAS Secretary General, it was rather controversial because he had inserted himself in the politics of the region in such a way which was unheard of. We also saw the division in the election of the head of the IDB. And you mentioned the lack of coordination of CARICOM foreign policy, which the Treaty of Chaguaramas set up COF4 to do. I saw contrary votes on the Palestinian issue in the UN. I have seen a drift towards normalizing a relationship with Morocco, which has totally disregarded the right to self-determination of the people of Western Sahara, something that we as Jamaicans and CARICOM have supported since 1975. But I find that the principles on which we stood in the past no longer seem to prevail. But, you know, so two things from that article that I want to ask you. It seems to me that Jamaica has been in the center of the disunity on most, if not all, of these issues. How do you perceive that?
It's hard to say because I don't, it's not clear to me what is the philosophical underpinning that drives our foreign policy if we have a different one from CARICOM. And I think if I better understood the philosophy, it would be better, I'd be better able to comment on it, but I just don't know. It's just not clear what the foreign policy objectives are. It can't be in a multilateral world that we're pursuing a foreign policy on our own. That doesn't jive. It seems that way, but there's no coherent logic there in my head. And so I would prefer to understand the motivations. I find that it's just too difficult to accept that in 2022, we are allowing ourselves to be used by other powers. I find that unacceptable. And therefore, I'm not going to say that's what's happening. I don't know. But whatever is happening, it doesn't look good. It doesn't feel good. Many Jamaicans are ashamed of the position that we find ourselves in now with respect to not just leadership of positions across the region, because we're a collective, and I don't think any one country ought to assume or assert the right of leadership. But I think there's a respect that Jamaicans have across the Caribbean.
And across the world.
Yes, and across the world, absolutely. A respect for our culture, for who we are and so on. And I think the concern that many of us face is that we're losing that. We're losing that because we're not seen as a principled nation, and a nation that is providing the kinds of inspiration that we did in the past, and also the kinds of clarity of position. If it's confusing for us in Jamaica, it's confusing for many across the world.
You mentioned a lack of a comprehensible foreign policy philosophy. Nothing, it seems, is transparent in what we do.
Mm-hmm.
But certain things are quite obvious based on the behavior and the actions taken by the government. And I'm not trying to lambast the government. Every country has a right to its own foreign policy. The question that arises, however, is Prime Minister Rowley of Trinidad and Tobago hitting on something that is bothering CARICOM leaders throughout the region. Are individual leaders kowtowing or taking orders from big powers? Do we still have the fortitude to stand up as a nation and as a cohesive region when we are faced with those choices? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that we have to be principled. I think let's start there. What are those principles that ought to guide, who we are and what we do? And I think the big principles that we're struggling with, that seems to be at the heart of the current war in the world, is this matter of democracy. It's that there are fundamental principles that ought to guide how we interact. And therefore, as we collaborate across the region, given our shared history and experiences, including an agreement that a democratic society is the society that we ought to work towards achieving democracy, then it says to me that we ought not to accept relationships with any country, even if they call themselves democratic countries that seek to thwart the will of the people, that seek to, have a kind of big stick, old colonial imperialist type approach to their objectives. And we ought not to, be comfortable in those kinds of places. And so I'm struggling to say that there are big countries and big forces across the world that believe in fundamental principles of democracy. We ought to stand solidly on those principles, even when administrations change in those countries that seem to lean away from those principles. Because I think it's an important lesson for all of us across the world is this: democracy is not a fixed thing that you achieve. You don't get there and you're there and it stays there. It's an ongoing process of achieving an ideal. And therefore, depending on the administration, you could have a democratic society in which the practices of our current administration weakens democracy. And we're seeing that in countries across the world. Absolutely. And so
we've seen that in the democratic country that is supposed to be an example for everybody.
For the whole world. And we know that. And so for me, if we are guided by these principles, then I think that we ought not to be vacillating around them, and we ought to have the fortitude and the integrity as a people and as a group of nations to stand firm together on those principles, because those are the principles that will get us through.
I couldn't agree with you more. You wrote in that article, I have to go back to that article, will we choose to remain mired in old colonial institutional arrangements with mindsets that foster divisiveness? Or will we choose to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery and liberate ourselves through new participatory governance arrangements that will empower us to shape the future we want? That brings me to the discussions taking place right now in Jamaica. The significance of removing the Queen as head of state. Tell us why we should and what are the real meanings of independence and nationhood in a republic status, contrary to the neo-colonial status that we find ourselves.
Well, let me firstly say that we should have done this long time.
Long time ago.
Long time. I mean, the whole issue of should have been settled from independence.
Absolutely.
And so, for whatever reason, it's not settled. After 60 years, it's time. And I think, there's no debate there about the fact that we've perpetuated the remnants of this colonial authoritarian rule that had trapped us for many years. Finally, we had some release at independence in 1962, and the dream and the hopes of a nation was riding on the fact that we could put a governance arrangement in place that could truly reflect the voice of the people. We could have done it then, and we must do it now. And I think that, for me, is the issue on the table. Will we continue to operate as if we owe somebody something, or we're part of that whole arrangement where a few people make it to the top and try to keep everybody else in their place?
Yes.
And in so doing,
that's the system we inherited And that is the system we have perpetrated.
Absolutely. And we use divisive tools as effective weapons. And the two political parties, I would say, is a good example because most everything in our country is defined in terms of which side politically you're on.
I know that.
And it's a very, very divisive arrangement. Now, yes, we know we need political parties, and that's how our political system is set up. But the real relevance for them, in my mind, when it comes to taking sides, is when it's time to vote. For most other times, it's about how do we build our nation together, whoever is in power, especially when you have a two-party system where you know that at some point your time will come, right?
Yes,
and you want all of the people of the nation to work with you to govern, right? So we should have settled this long ago. Yes, it's about the symbolism of, having our own head of state. I agree, all of that is important. It will lift the, a sense of pride in who we are and so on. But for me, that's not enough. It's not enough because we ought to have gone over that hurdle of a sense of who we are and so on since independence. Right? And that for me, what is at issue is that we now are at this point where we have to interrogate this idea of what a republic is.
Who are we?
Exactly, and the kind of nation we want, and our active role in building that nation. It's not enough for us to simply go to elections ever so often, vote, and quite frankly, I'll be frank, in some cases, sell your vote, right? And you have a party in power, and you simply wait for that party to create magic, to do all the work, and absolutely don't participate in that process of governing and holding the representatives accountable, etc. So for me, for the past 60 years, this issue has been about the way Jamaicans have engaged our society. If we passively sit back and wait for others to fix up Jamaica for us, we get what we get. That's what we did for the last 60 years, as far as I'm concerned. And those of us who have been active have not been enough. More of us need to have been active.
You talk about improved participatory governance. You're an advocate for that principle. What do we really have to do?
Well, I think the first thing is how we see ourselves in this democracy. And I made a point about seeing ourselves as owners of Jamaica. We can't see ourselves as tenants or squatters, right? Somebody else owns Jamaica and we're simply, tagging along or being told what to do. That's an important mindset because I think if you feel Jamaica belongs to somebody else and not you, then I think it means that you're waiting for somebody to fix the problems.
Right.
So I start there. And I say this to my brothers and sisters in the diaspora. I spent 20 years in the diaspora, and I remember that ongoing conversation that
did you?
Oh, yes. And I remember the conversation is, when Jamaica better we go home, right? And I kept saying to my friends, listen, we better go home and be part of fixing up Jamaica. And I want to urge people in the diaspora, if you want to see a better Jamaica, roll up your sleeves and come on down. There's a lot of work to do. And I say that then because it is the active engagement in the society that will change it, not a passive one. So for me, I start right there. The other point to make is that as long as we have a representative democracy in which we elect people to represent us, then part of our obligation, in my mind, our civic responsibility, is to hold them accountable.
Yeah.
And I think about it as if, like, if you have a business and you have an employee, you hire someone to manage this business on your behalf. Because
Definitely.
you want to do other things in life. You want to, so make somebody else deal with the nuts and bolts. First of all, you make sure that you bring people that is qualified and can really properly represent your interests. That's the first thing. You don't simply take anybody you get.
And the diaspora has vast resources of qualified people, many of whom are willing to provide their expertise and experiences in the development of Jamaica. But there is no mechanism that has been established that can effectively harness diaspora resources.
Well, I mean, certainly one thing that the diaspora, people in diaspora are free to do is to feed their own candidates, for that matter, and be part of a political process. Once you're eligible, I mean, there are many of us who have dual citizens, etc. Now, from my perspective, there are many ways the people in the diaspora can engage. And it could also be to support financially and otherwise other individuals, organizations that are trying to create a better Jamaica. So there are many things that can be done. But I want to just make that point about how we treat our employers if we had someone managing our business, and how we ought to do the same with the people we employ to manage our country on our behalf.
Yes.
So we give them this job based on their qualification, but then we monitor them. We don't just leave them up to just do what they want to do. We monitor them. And guess what? We get to the point where if you're not doing your job, we're going to fire you, right? And so we right now have a bill in Parliament called the impeachment bill.
Yes,
and
yes.
we're now discussing what we need to do to literally fire people we elect who are not doing their job, right? And who are abusing their power, etc. So those are the kinds of conversations we need to have. And we have to actively get involved in making those decisions and put in arrangements in the Constitution if necessary to make sure that the things we want to get done are done.
Professor Hamilton, this has been a very rich discussion. We've touched on several things, and there are so many other issues that we could continue in this discussion. But we have limited time space for each episode, and I really want to thank you for being my special guest today on RealTalk with Ambassador Curtis Ward. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.